Hello, everyone. This is an impromptu live session around the Microsoft Customer Agreement. I would like you to go through this with you and see what it is, what it entails, what Microsoft's plans are, if they're sticking to their plans, and how some of it currently works for what is possible with it. So what is the Microsoft Customer Agreement? The Microsoft Customer Agreement is a new agreement where all the Microsoft licenses and services will be bought through. So how Microsoft positions this themselves is that they state, instead of buying through a variety of licensing programs, you'll be able to purchase through a newly created fully digital agreement, which we simply call the Microsoft Customer Agreement. Our goal is to provide a consistent and simplified purchase experience with greater flexibility in how and where you buy. With the Microsoft Customer Agreement, we've introduced a streamlined way to buy. You accept one straightforward purchasing agreement that's always up to date and doesn't expire, whether you buy directly from Microsoft or a Microsoft partner. This helps shorten the buying process by getting proposals from your Microsoft sales representative or your partner. There's a less administrative overhead with no lengthy paperwork required. Simply accept the customer agreement and you're ready to go. So this is obviously a lot of marketing talk, but there are a couple of things that immediately jump out at you. So for me, if I look at this, the first thing that pops out is a fully digital agreement. What that means is that it's going to be signed digitally. There's probably going to be exceptions made here, but if you're a very old school organization that does not generally want to sign digitally and still wants to put the wet ink on a piece of paper, it's going to be a bit more difficult for you. Second thing, purchasing agreements. The MPSA has purchasing agreements. How does it work? You sign a top-level agreement, and under that, you sign all the purchasing agreements you want. This means that you can have a purchasing agreement for your finance department or for a set of affiliates. You can have a purchasing agreement for one person if you want. So that creates a lot of flexibility. Just wondering how that is going to work out in the end for all the different services that Microsoft offers. The simplified purchasing experience. Ever since they announced the MPSA, this is something that they've been striving for. So the EA in its model is quite a behemoth of contractual paperwork. But with this, they envision a world where you just sign a couple of pages and that is all that you need. I started working at Microsoft in 2011. And in 2011, it was stated that they were going to work towards the next generation volume licensing. That's now 10 years ago. And initially they started with the MPSA, and now they have released the customer agreement a while back for Azure only. And it will expand upon it towards other services and software. But my question remains is if the amount of innovation that they have on their contractual vehicles is this slow and it takes more than 10 years to release something that they might be satisfied with, how is that going to end up? For the MPSA, it ended up that the plug was pulled and that they moved to something else again, which is now in front of you. The next thing that jumps out is the contract doesn't expire. Just like, for instance, your master agreement with Microsoft, it's evergreen. It will be there forever. How will they introduce committed offers to it, like with the enterprise agreement? Is there an option for it? Will you get beneficial pricing in some sense? These are questions that jump to my mind. Finally, there's a less administrative overhead. This in premise sounds fine, but we're going to have to wait and see if this is true, because I can imagine a scenario where we're going to have this live alongside all the organizations that have very custom-made agreements for a long time. And this actually then creates more administrative overhead, because this will, as we're going to jump into, entail a whole different approach to how Microsoft envisions their contracting and purchasing. So how does Microsoft look at this? Well, Microsoft basically sees a large bucket that you can fill with all the offers that Microsoft has. So whether it being software, cloud services, server subscriptions, Azure consumption services, all that Microsoft has to offer should fit in that bucket. And then they say it doesn't matter how and where you buy it. So you can buy it through partners, you can buy it through Microsoft itself, called Microsoft LED, or you can buy it through the website, which they call self-service. If you choose any of these or all of these different routes of purchasing, you can all do that through signing the Microsoft Customer Agreement. So you can buy certain products through partners, others directly through Microsoft, and for a certain set of services that you might need on the fly, you could even buy those through the website. It all goes through the Microsoft Customer Agreement, and you don't have to switch between contracts or how you buy it. Partners obviously sign a Microsoft Partner Agreement with Microsoft, and it works similar to the way it already works with CSP. It's just not called CSP anymore, but it's called the Microsoft Customer Agreement. So how does it differ to, for instance, an enterprise agreement or a different type of Microsoft agreement, like a old school Select Plus or something like that? In the old way, you could only sign on paper, and there's the digital option that came with the introduction of e-agreements, but it was always a paper signature. In the new way of work, it will just be digital signature. There's already been some changes made here, meaning that they allow for a wet physical signature as well. The agreement structure has been greatly improved. So for an enterprise agreement, you typically sign a master agreement, an enterprise agreement, the enrollments, a CPS, previous contact information form, a product selection form, amendments, etc., etc., etc. While they say that it's no longer needed. You just sign the Microsoft Customer Agreement. What is interesting to note here, and we will discuss it more in the coming slides as well, is that if you add certain services to your Microsoft Customer Agreement, Microsoft will load these terms and conditions specific to that service or piece of software that you're buying to the customer agreement. So initially, your contract might be only 11 pages, whereas an enterprise agreement could be 20 to 100. But it could quickly expand as well based on the services and software that you're going to buy under your customer agreement. They greatly introduced the days to process. So they stipulate that it, on average, took around 9.1 days to execute an enterprise agreement fully. And in the new situation, it will only take 2 days for them to set up the customer agreement. And the systems you have to use should be drastically reduced as well. In an enterprise agreement, you have all these different portals and systems that you had to use, especially if you're a large account reseller or an LSP. You had things like Explore MS and the Office 365 admin portal, the MPSA portal, the voluminizing service center, etc., etc., etc. And in the new situation, they say that there's only a couple of portals, a max of 4. So you have the contracting portal, and maybe you have the Office 365 administration portal, the Azure portal, and that's going to be it. And finally, a thing that I think is very helpful and has been long overdue is the way they handle invoicing. And we will have a couple of slides on this as well. It's hard to match an invoice to the services in an enterprise agreement. Everybody's struggling with it. All the financial departments are always have their hands in their hair around how Microsoft handles their invoicing. In the new situation, and I will show a couple of examples, the overview will be easier, and you can even set up billing profiles so that you can immediately do or have the cross-charging done by Microsoft. Now, if you're a partner, what does it mean? The CSP has already been turned to the Microsoft Cloud, Microsoft Customer Agreement. Initially, CSP was set up and they called the agreement the Microsoft Cloud Agreement. It's now the Microsoft Customer Agreement. So all CSP partners have already been turned on to the new Microsoft Customer Agreement portal. There's not a lot of difference between the old one and the new one, but the new one will obviously have the more innovation to it. So not new either, but with the Microsoft Customer Agreement, Microsoft is putting more focus on value-added services. So it's actually asking the partners if and how you're going to put services on top of the MCA to help add value to the stack. How are you going to, as a partner, going to make a difference with the customers and organizations that you're going to service with Microsoft products and services? And this is something that they're investing heavily on. So all partners, no matter you being an SI or an LSP, you're going to have to show Microsoft what you are going to do to help the adoption of the platform. With the change in the contract models comes a change in the incentive models for partners. So whereas you're typically used to the, as an LSP, for instance, to the incentive models for the enterprise agreement, this will get a total overhaul on the Microsoft Customer Agreement. There's details on this, but I won't dive too far into this in this presentation. So this is a slide that I created based on what I heard while I was at Microsoft. And you quickly see that we're probably way behind with the Microsoft Customer Agreement release that Microsoft has envisioned themselves, because they state that in calendar wave 1 would start in calendar year 19, and it was actually true. They started with opening up the Microsoft Customer Agreement to Azure only deals, and it was mandatory for a customer-led, so self-service through the website, but optional for partner and Microsoft-led, so you could still sign Microsoft Azure contracts, standalone contracts through other channels. In August and November of 2020, they decided to remove the Azure-only server and cloud enrollment option, and any new Azure customers would move to the Microsoft Customer Agreement immediately. For Azure additions to an enterprise agreement contract or additions to a server and cloud enrollment. So for instance, if you had a server and cloud enrollment with core infrastructure or SQL Server in it, you could still tie Azure into that. Or if you had an enterprise agreement and you were renewing that, you could still tie Azure into that as well. So it's not taken away from the enterprise agreement fully, but a lot of things, the thing that has changed the most was to be able to sign an Azure only SCE. In that time frame, they also expanded the possibilities around certain contractual changes that you could make. So amendments were possible for financing regulations, GDPR, investment funds, HIPAA, and so a lot of the basic things that would require certain industries to be able to sign these contracts. Now is where it gets interesting. What they stated back in the day was that in calendar year 2020, which we've already passed, they would add different cloud services like M365 in the D365 portfolio. They will be optional for Microsoft-led, optional for partner-led, and mandatory for customer-led or self-service. This has not happened yet. With the small distinction that for the CSP model, the entire CSP model, as I said, was changed to Microsoft Customer Agreement. So basically, if you're buying through CSP, you're already on the Microsoft Customer Agreement. For Microsoft-led and self-service, this has not been included yet, and this is still goes through the standard channels like an enterprise agreement or just the relevant website. Wave 3, the second half of calendar year 20, software and hybrid options should have been added. But as we know, the previous phase has not been fully concluded. So this phase has also not been done yet. You see some changes going into CSP with the option to buy server subscriptions and certain on-premises licenses as a subscription through CSP. But other than that, for the Microsoft-led motion and the self-serve motion, it is not an option yet. So if we look at this with the license queue glasses on, our takeaways are that this is yet, at the moment, it is yet another contract from Microsoft. So it will add to the already increased complexity that is Microsoft contracting. It has a totally new portal, a new structure, and it will, as such, if you are going to use this, have an impact on your IT asset management. New contracts to manage, new portals to manage, additional one-size-fits-all. You buy through it, there's no standardization options, there's no custom agreement options. So for many companies, especially the larger enterprise organizations, this is not going to be something that they want to adopt fully. It works for CSP partners, as they already had to move from the cloud agreement to the Microsoft customer agreement. So basically, they're keeping their promise on that aspect. There you see that it's pretty much rolled out fully. It's not up and running for all cloud services yet in a direct model. I'd love to see this because I'd like to understand further how they're going to handle committed offers like what you have in an enterprise agreement right now. And I'm very interested to see how Microsoft will handle the licensing overview for the customers. Because right now you can request your Microsoft license statement or MLS from Microsoft. And they had issues in integrating the MPSA purchases into the MLS. They do it now. It's quite of a manual motion. But how are they going to handle this going forward? How are they going to handle if the move to the MCA is fully done? How are they going to handle the purchases of their old school licenses? I have seen some screenshots from Microsoft where they have now gotten a new portal where all contracts are listed for a specific top parent customer they have. So if you buy through the EA, Select Plus, MPSA, CSP, Open Value, and you have all these different contract types within your organization, Microsoft has a list and they can see what you buy through what, where you're buying. Now, I hope that they will generate this with a customer view as well, so that within the MCA, you can immediately see what old school contractual vehicles you are using. Another point that I'm quite intrigued by and what I would like to know more about is how price protection is being handled. Within an enterprise agreement right now, you get 3-year price protection. And as of this moment, for Azure and the MCA, it doesn't exist. So you're going from a model where you might have had 3-year pricing threshold that you could not grow above, but only could benefit from price reductions. In the MCA, you're going to be affected by month-over-month pricing changes. Like I said already a couple of times, legal-wise, they're not handling custom terms right now. They're only adding specific standardized amendments that they already have in the enterprise agreement. So how will they do this to make it possible for larger enterprise organizations to adopt the custom agreement as well? And finally, product and cloud services specific language. So this will be added upon the procurement of the software and services. So if you sign a Microsoft customer agreement without adding any services at the start of the contract, it will just hold the basic terms. But when you start procuring certain software and services, the idea is that the contract will be extended with the specific terms and conditions to the products and services that you're buying, if any. How will they handle that? How will you review that? How will you be able to review that upfront? Is Microsoft going to be able to show you all these terms that might be added? And how can you customize that in the long run? So it is it's showing promise, I should say, but there's a lot of questions outstanding, and that I have before I'm fully able to review and give a conclusion around the future state of Microsoft contracting and licensing. So what is possible right now is Azure. So I want to take some time to go into the Azure specifics of the Microsoft Customer Agreement and look at how that works from this perspective. So this is some information that I have gathered from Microsoft as well. So Azure in the MCA provides deal-making flexibility supported by existing capabilities. So as of November 1st, 2020, when the policy launch was effective, you could no longer renew Azure-only SEs or sign new Azure-only SEs. There was no new introduction of Azure to a current desktop EA if you did not already have Azure in your desktop EA, and no Azure on any new desktop EAs. This means also that for Azure in an SE, if you did not previously have Azure in your SE, for which you also had SQL and Windows Server, for instance, or SYS, I should say, then you could not sign the desktop or server and cloud enrollment. So how does it work deal-making wise? So if you look at billing and payment, what is possible within the Microsoft Customer Agreement is to have a pay-as-you-go or an Azure prepayment option. So you could either just pay retroactively month over month, or you could make an upfront payment for the entire Azure commitment and start consuming from that. There's financing options, meaning that if you are making a prepayment, but you would like to spread it out over a specific term, then that is something that you can discuss with Microsoft. And the terms, as described earlier, they allow some standard amendments that are basically required for people in certain industries that have specific regulatory requirements, like HIPAA, like GDPR, like the financing amendment. And they can make changes to publicity, and they can add things like an ESIF amendment if they are adding investment funds tied to a specific Azure purchase. If you look at the investments that Microsoft can make, if you commit to a certain amount of Azure, either in a prepayment or in an Azure consumption commitment, which is what MACC stands for, a consumption commitment as in I commit that over the coming term, I'm going to spend a minimum of X, and then you just start consuming. It's not the same as a prepayment because this is a commitment that you sign on paper. Tied to these prepayments and these Microsoft Azure consumption commitment offers, you could get an Azure commitment discount. You could get investment funds, like I previously said, and you could even get Azure credit offers, which is basically free Azure credits in your portal. So this is the overview that I just described. This has gone into effect on November 1st, 2020. Customers in direct markets, which is very important. If you're in direct market, you can still sign Azure through the enterprise agreement, but in direct markets, you cannot initiate or renew an Azure-only SE or introduce Azure to a desktop EA. These are all the different options and what is and isn't possible. So have a look through these slides if this is of interest to you. But basically, if you're signing a new contract, you're not allowed to add Azure. Enterprise agreement contract, you're not allowed to add Azure to it. If you are signing a new Azure-only contract, you cannot do it anymore. So then you should move to the Microsoft Customer Agreement. So if we look at the invoicing part, this is something that I already touched on at the beginning of this presentation. On screen, you currently see what an Azure invoice looks like under the enterprise agreement. And there's a lot of items that are on it that do not generally make a lot of sense to have on your invoice. And kind of blurs the picture a bit. So how do you find out through this overview what you've actually consumed and when? Well, you can't really, because this is the same for everything in the enterprise agreement, ranging from Azure to cloud services to software purchases. So it lists price levels, which is not needed because within Azure there's no price difference between level A, B, C, or D. So that doesn't have a value on the invoice anymore. It shows a usage country, but that's not generally where the Azure service is being consumed, because you can have a contract signed in the Netherlands, but you can use Azure services all over the world. And there's application, or there's a pool listed in one of the columns that refers to application server or systems and has something to do with your price level. But again, that is obsolete information because it doesn't make sense in the Azure sense. That being said, this is just a review of what happens with Azure. There's no information yet on how they handle this, for instance, for Microsoft 365, or if this information should be on there. I don't think it should be because it's just fluff, but I'm interested to see how the invoice would look like if they're going to add different types of services. What does an Azure invoice look like from the Microsoft customer agreement? Well, basically what you see on the right is what, and if you're already using it, it should look familiar to you. So the new invoice layout displays charges, and it should be way more intuitive, they say, and you can organize your cost within your invoice. So you have some matter of flexibility on how you set up and what you get to see when you download your invoices. So you can create your own sections and summaries to get the relevant insights from your invoice. Any used charges and purchases are then reflected on the appropriate section of the invoice, as well as a summary of the spend across all sections. What additionally to this, what is also new is the ability to self-service your invoice. So you can add billing profiles in the portal and set the profiles in such a way that you will be able to download the different invoices per your billing account. So if you need billing accounts for different departments within your organization, like marketing, accounting, and sales, you can specify what charges to bill to which department, and the Microsoft customer agreement will allow you to separate these charges in their relevant invoices and be able to download this accordingly. This is a very cool new feature because it allows you to actually create the invoices as to the level of granularity that you need, and to be able to cross-charge to your department much more easily and effectively, instead of getting one upfront invoice for all the charges and you having to manually sift through them and separate the charges to deliver to different parts of your organization. So that was it for this time. I think this gives a relatively great overview of what is possible in the Microsoft customer agreement and what isn't. For Azure, it shows a lot of promise, especially if you look at the invoicing aspect of it. And I'd love to see more towards the near future from Microsoft on how they're going to include all the other offers into this platform. So when they do make changes to it, I'll be sure to jump online and tell you what these changes are and what they look like, and if there's anything worth noting and mentioning. So thank you for following this, and I hope to see you very quickly.